Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Everybody who might be attending or watching virtually. My name is Stephen Gayle. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Afro-Amerindian Research and Cultural Center. We are a nonprofit organization based out of Metro Atlanta. And I want to welcome you to the first ARC Roundtable. This space is meant to offer a platform for multiple perspectives with regard to African American and Native American communities, as well as their various intersections. With that said, the views expressed at this roundtable do not necessarily reflect those of ARC Center, its members, partners, affiliates, or donors. And those who wish to submit questions or comments can do so via the live chat on YouTube or use the hashtag ARC Roundtable. It's AARCC Roundtable, all one word. And with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have Chief Eagle Elk, author-in-chief of the Sakore Wakom. Shania Cordis, assistant professor of anthropology at Spelman College. Sutton King, executive director of the Urban Indigenous Collective. Kimberly Knight, chair for Black Indians of NC, Powwow Committee. And Frederick Murphy, filmmaker and founder of History Before Us. So welcome, everybody.
Welcome. Thank you
for having us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and I guess just picking up where we were at, we were discussing pretty much the relevancy of this current discussion, or the idea of this discussion being extremely relevant based off of current events. So please excuse me. So if you guys could start off with, I guess we can begin with Kimberly. What do you think about the current events as it stands, and how does that relate to both African American and Native American cross sections?
Thank you so much for having me today, Stephen. For me, I think personally, my views are people are exhausted. They are exhausted of seeing images of themselves and police brutality. They're exhausted of seeing injustices done to people, lack of convictions, lack of accountability when it comes to law enforcement or either people that are non-Native and non-African American that are causing criminal actions against people. I think we're also seeing a time of a lot of civil unrest because we're seeing Native lands that are being taken back from tribes. And we're seeing that on the Native presence on the reservations now at risk for those issues. Also, we're seeing extreme famine and poverty when it comes to reservations when we talk about COVID-19 and how it's affecting nations like the Navajo Nation. So for me, I personally think that there is a lot of civil unrest, and I think that Black people, African Americans, as well as Native Americans are exhausted and tired.
And to kind of piggyback off of that, you know, from a mental health and emotional and spiritual and, you know, just a holistic health standpoint, I think that what's happening here is historical trauma has just been triggered on an all-time level. You know what I'm saying? And I think that people are looking at this as an opportunity to actually flex their autonomy to say that at this point in time, it's just not going to happen anymore. And it doesn't matter what that looks like. It may not look politically correct. It may not look humanely correct to a lot of people. But when people actually take a gander and look back over certain things that have been happening for centuries upon centuries, they're like, F it. I don't care at this point, because we've tried every other method in order to be able to move the needle forward for some type of equity and equality, and it's just not working. And when you have these different systemic issues that have been put in place and have been a mainstay for so many years, when people have cried, they've begged, they've done everything that they could within their power to be peaceful with doing this, this is the reaction of it. So there's a sense of empowerment that is happening right now for people in this country. And again, it may look unorthodox, completely unorthodox, but I'm not here to judge that. But this is what it is, that this is what they're doing. And, you know, in their mind, this is right, regardless of what anyone else says.
And if I could just add one thing too, just a general observation I noticed was the officer in question in Minneapolis. He had complaints against him in the past regarding incidents, or among many incidents, two involving Native American individuals. So I think maybe even the relevance of, or if there was more of a connection between the two communities, a more vocal presence, maybe this entire incident could have been prevented if abuse and brutality against Native Americans was also put at the forefront when it occurs, and if there were solidarity between the two communities. So I think to some extent, recognizing that, I know, I just thought that was just a interesting notion that, like, if we had been paying attention to what was going on in Native communities as well, maybe this entire incident could have been prevented. At least this particular instance could have been prevented. But yeah, what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and that's something that I wanted to highlight on my platform. And it's interesting because there's some people who feel like highlighting the point that you just made contributes to an erasure of the African American struggle. However, I think that there is this intersectionality that we can look at, that Native Americans are also more likely to be killed by law enforcement than any other racial or ethnic group. And we don't really have the outrage or the support when it comes to our women and men being murdered. We do have the hashtag MMIWG, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, women, and Two-Spirit. However, I still think that there's a lack of highlight, and a lot of times we say we're missing, we're missing one physically, we're missing in the data, and we're missing in the media. And I think that's very true. And I think there's an opportunity for us to come together and uplift our voices and say, hey, there's a lot of commonalities between our communities. How can we come together and strengthen our voice? Because there's just there's power in numbers.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Sutton. I think too, one of the things that I'm finding more and more is that we cannot continue to look to these kind of narratives about our communities, right? They give these very oversimplified, often erasure, right, that is replicated in privileging one struggle over the other. And I think what we are increasingly asking ourselves right now is, how do we look to one another to recognize our political struggles, right? What kind of work do we need to do internally as part of our everyday practices and part as collective communities in order to support our mutual kind of struggle against state violence, structural violence, right? And, folks have been saying this for a very long time, that our recognition and our ability to address these concerns is not going to come from the state, right? It's not going to come from, increasing better relationships with the police, right? It's not going to come from, these on high policies that folks put so much emphasis on as the solution. And so it's going to be uncomfortable, but I think we need to really look more towards one another and refuse to look to the state and refuse to whiteness, for lack of a better word, as the way forward.
So any other thoughts on that?
You mind if I add something?
Sure. It's open forum. Again, this whole thing isn't supposed to be as structured. It's kind of just people just talking, like if we're in a circle talking somewhere. So yeah, proceed.
I find social media a good place to kind of see where everybody's mindsets are. You get to see both sides of the railroad. You get to see your Caucasian community, the various spectrum of the Native communities, the pro-blacks, the more of your Christian Black conservatives. You get to see you get to see so much on there. It kind of gives you an idea where everybody's mindsets are. What I've noticed from the time of Rodney King, this has been happening for a long time. We get mad and we reach out the only way we know how, and that's by what they call that, the voice of the unheard. We start attacking the communities. If If you can't get government and government officials to listen to you, that gets their attention, so that's what they do. Unfortunately, you have organizations like Antifa who will come in and then they initiate looting and other means of force, and it make it look like you have a lot of the people out there for social injustice, just out there for being opportunists. If more people, one of the things east of the Mississippi, we have such a racial clash in the native community. We can't even get natives to agree with each other to like natives. We can't get it's hard to even get African community to agree with each other on things. So we're talking about coming together. One thing I seen that the Black Panthers and the AIM, the American Indian movement had going for them back in the day. I mean, whatever faults they have, one thing that they did get right, they supported each other. You know, I think AIM came to Oakland and supported the Black Panthers. Black Panthers went to Alcatraz, supported AIM, right? That's something that we don't have, that's hard to find today. Both sides supported each other. I think, I cannot remember the name of the chief. I think it was Lone Wolf. I sure hate it if I'm saying his name wrong. He gave a speech up in DC, and he talked about the power that the Black and the brown have if they chose to come together, and the things that they could change, starting with policies, looking at human rights instead of civil rights. People don't even realize that they still meet every so often, I forget how many years, but they still meet and vote on us having the right to vote. People don't even realize that they're voting for you to have affirmative action, the right to vote, and a lot of these slave codes are still on the books. I know I'm one of the people who, I don't bash all police officers, because my family, I have many family members who work in law enforcement. They're not out there doing these things, and they hate when they see the bad cops doing it, because it makes their job much harder. So I don't cookie cut it across the board and say all cops are bad. The system is messed up because of the policies. So more training needs to take place. But more importantly, the communities need to find a way to come together. Stop using this political affiliations to divide each other. Stop using skin tone and hair texture. And stop using religion, where you're a Muslim, where you're a Christian, or you're an atheist. Martin said not to judge people by their skin. I'm misquoting everybody, but basically he was saying the content of the character is how you judge a person, right? So I'm all up for finding ways for us to come together, regardless of what walk of life we come from. And I think until we find a way to do that, this is just going to keep happening as it has been happening, and we can keep doing the same thing as we have been doing the same thing from the past. The brother that just got killed in Minneapolis, it's not going to end there. It's getting ready to happen again. It's just a matter of time. You would think that the police officers doing these things will learn from what what the other cops are doing, but they're not. They're not. So I mean, we need to find a way to work together and deal with these policies. Sorry, I'm long-winded sometimes.
No problem. If I could, I know I said I was going to be more passive, but if I just could interject a couple of things. So one thing I noticed,
Go ahead.
You know, I think particularly with African Americans and Native Americans in our relationship with the United States, it's a very interesting dichotomy. Like there's you have African Americans who oftentimes were, we were more often victimized. We were victimized by the state overall, but when it comes to local governance, we were more subjected to the local governance, and we looked to the federal governance to kind of alleviate those grievances, right? Whether it was slavery, Jim Crow, whatever. And so we always look for the federal government to kind of help us. And the state government was usually the ones that we were fighting against. Whereas it seems with Native communities, the federal government was always the issue. And so like this idea, like that dichotomy kind of plays out differently, because when you start talking about this intersection between both populations, that I find very interesting, and I think it complicates things a lot. And then also to speak to your other point in terms of supporting each other, I think that was part of the reason why, you know, this conversation I think is important. But I also want to address, like, well, how do you, how can each community show support for each other without co-opting or without stepping on toes to the point where they're speaking for communities they don't belong to, you know? And I think that's one of the fundamental areas, because then again, it comes into that, especially when you're talking about, you know, federally recognized tribes, state recognized tribes, unrecognized people who are reclaiming ancestry, you know, and people who are unaffiliated completely with a particular demographic or tribal affiliation. And then they all try to step on top of each other to support what they think they're supporting when they're actually undoing some elements to it. So, I mean, if we could just do like a round of you guys kind of addressing some of those topics.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm glad that you spoke to this kind of complex relationship that we all have with the government, whether that's state or federal. I spent time working on the first culturally tailored simulation that trained law enforcement how to engage with tribal youth without re-traumatizing them. So by teaching law enforcement about historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, how that actually has an effect on the adolescent brain through the ACEs study, looking at how their presence alone is traumatizing, is triggering. What I saw in building that simulation and implementing it and working with law enforcement, whether that was tribal law enforcement, state law enforcement, the native law enforcement understood it. They got it. But the issue with that is that the majority of the tribal police or the police policing native bodies are not native or indigenous. And so for those folks that I, trained them on that simulation, this was new to them, you know? And so how do we decolonize through training? And how do we, is training enough? That's my question. You know, when this was the first culturally tailored simulation ever to hit law enforcement hands back in 2016, and when Trump came into, the picture, that funding was cut by the Department of Justice, and so that training is somewhere sitting on a shelf, with so much hard work behind it being built with, Native communities. But that's just my question. Is it enough with this really complex trauma that we have that's unresolved? I'd like to highlight that. This is unresolved historical trauma that's being perpetuated by intergenerational trauma and socioeconomic barriers that are exacerbating, what we're feeling. Is training enough? That's my question and my thought.
I don't think that it is. As a licensed therapist who's worked in all kind of different communities and, obviously studying historical trauma, I think that brown and black people, and I'll just use that term, and this Native and African Americans, I'll just use that term. No offense to anyone, by the way. We have to be more empathetic towards each other. We have to understand that our plight and our histories are so similar, right? I read this book called Ebony and Ivy, and it's a book on the enslaved individuals who built Ivy League schools. These Ivy League schools were using enslaved and natives' bodies in order to, of course, do research and experimental things by scalping natives' heads, looking into their brains, African bodies, doing the exact same thing, right? I think the issue is that when things got quote unquote better, so many assimilated to this ideology of white folks, this westernized ideology with regards to what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, and completely suppressed or just, completely forgot about all those things from a generational standpoint and how similar they were back then, right? And the thing is, they never changed. It's just manipulated and it's looked differently, right? It's manifested itself in a different way, shape, or form. So I think that providing different opportunities to where Blacks and Natives can actually sit down with each other, not necessarily shoot the breeze going back in the past and comparing, right? Because it's not necessarily a comparison piece. It's an opportunity to be empathetic and understand that our plight has really been the exact same thing, right? I mean, let's look back at when Ireland was going through their famine. Native people from this country sent money over there, right? And I seen where recently some citizens from residents from Ireland, or I guess citizens of Ireland, sent money back. I don't know if the government from Ireland did such, which I would have preferred to see that. Like, why isn't your government breaking that bread off to the Native community that helped y'all out? It had to be the people individually. So like the sister said earlier, you can't depend on these states and these governments to doing it for you. You have to do it yourself. And I think that right now, more than any other time, at least in my 40 years of living, there's no better time to do such right now when you're to have these Black and brown bodies to actually sit down together and have these communications to get back to the roots of how all of our ancestors saw what resilience looked like, and how from a cultural standpoint we have to stay connected, because there's a very strong bond between the two entities.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, I've had some conversations where I've invited folk. I teach at Spelman, which is a Black women's college, HBCU in Atlanta. And I've had the opportunity to invite Native Indigenous women and facilitate a conversation where we talk about it, where we have a real, substantial, uncomfortable, messy conversation about what it means to, first of all, problematize our own language, right? The way that when we think about the solutions, it's to remotely go to policing, increasing of policing of our own Black and brown bodies, right? Investing more in whiteness, right? Investing our energy in policies that we know have never actually been upheld. They've always been nominal. They've always been in name only. And so I think we're really at a moment, and we have been for a very long time, where we have to create a new language between ourselves. We have to really imagine a different horizon for ourselves. And, there's a way that there's residue that's surely going to be there. There's going to be the lingering trauma, the lingering histories of all that we've inherited, right? But I think we are at a moment where we get to decide, right? And COVID, folks have framed it as being forced to stay in place. But we can also look at it as an opportunity to be still long enough to have these conversations with each other, right? For sure, there's privilege in that, and being able to stay home or not, right? As we're seeing with the protests, we have folks who are weighing the kind of precarity and the vulnerabilities that we are, bearing the brunt of, right? Whether it's a virus, a pandemic, or it's state violence with the police. These are the kinds of decisions that folks are being forced to grapple with. And I think now is a moment for us to, and an invitation, I would say, to move slower, we have a long history of political movements, of Black social movements, of Indigenous Native social movements, and the kind of relationships that have been forged between us to look back to, and contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, that folks are really trying to have these concrete conversations. And so, these kinds of forums, I think, are beautiful. I'm interested in also thinking about, what does it mean for us to proliferate this? What does it mean for us to have this kind of sustained conversation with one another in a way that is not mediated, in a way that is not mediated by white people, for lack of a better word, or folks who are non-Black and non-Native?
And I think to go back to what Brother Eagle Elk had mentioned, colorism has plagued our communities for so long, right? It's like, what was it, Jim Jones, the brother, the guy that was took everybody over in Africa, and they all drank this Kool-Aid and passed the Jim Jones piece. Like,
it was in Guyana, in South America.
Thank you. So, like, we drank that with the colorism piece, and because in certain communities we can't even get past that, it makes it so much more difficult for us to work outwardly because of the internal conflicts that we're having, literally based on your hair, your hair, your hair, his hair, her hair, etc., skin, lips, nose, all these different things, right? So we have to find a way to understand that the Creator created people, and we can't determine what that is, right? I can't say that, well, when I come out, I want to be light skinned. I don't get that option. You know what I'm saying? So we have to also break down this colorism piece first before we're able to be vested enough into each other to where we say, you know what, I can look past that. Let's move on. I mean, it went so much to where we created societies back in the day based on a person's skin color. You know what I'm saying? So that's how deeply rooted this is, of course. But I am optimistic that times like this hopefully will galvanize our communities to where we can say, regardless of this, regardless of that, regardless of what was embedded in me and passed down from this generation to that generation, from a colorism standpoint, that I love my brother and sister enough to push that to the side and move forward. So yeah, I just thought that what Brother Eagle Elk had mentioned earlier is very relevant with regards to us jumping over that hurdle and get to the next step.
And I'd also like to just make a point based on that, talking about racial classification in the United States and what that means. I mean, being Afro-Indigenous, being Black, being Native, you know, on one side, you've got this, this rule, this one drop rule, right? This social and legal principle that the United States has upheld for so long. And then the other side, you've got this blood quantum that we still struggle with, you know? And so I think it's very interesting that how we see racial classification and the erasure of either, you know, African folk or native folk, and what that means for us, and having a relationship with the United States government when we're being kind of policed on our identities, and what that means for me. I mean, I'm because my Black blood quantum is too much. I cannot be, you know, acknowledged as an enrolled citizen of the Menominee or the Oneida tribe. But I do have my descendancy papers, and that makes me a second degree. And so I can get Indian Health Service care. But other than that, I can't vote in my tribes. And so just looking at how the United States government has policed, you know, Indigenous sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, and, you know, I've heard stories of other Afro-Indigenous women who felt like they couldn't claim being Native or Indigenous because of this rule of, you know, one drop, or, you know, not being enrolled in a tribe. And so, you know, because your blood quantum isn't enough, so you don't count as a Native, or your Indigenous perspective doesn't matter. So I think that really adds to the colorism that we're seeing in our communities, that's pitting us against one another. And I think that there's got to be a way that we do away with this racial classification in the 21st century, you know, and how tribes are still monitoring their tribal members by this outdated, in my opinion, blood quantum method.
I'd like to speak on that too. For me, I'm the founder of the Black Indians NC Facebook group, as well as being the lead organizer for our powwow, the Black Indians NC powwow, which will be the first Black and Indigenous people's powwow for North Carolina. Being that I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, my father made it very present for me to be able to know my Native culture at a very early age. I learned Cherokee at a very early age. So learning the language of Kiwaka was very important to him. As well as learning English. And for me and my experiences growing up in Eastern North Carolina, there was a lot of colorism, as we also heard, you know, other people have talked about today on the panel. The brother talked about below about colorism and how Indigenous and Native Black communities have had this divide. But one thing we also have to look at too, when we're talking about Indigenous people and reclassification and things with labels, we're looking at oppressive behaviors that are coming from the oppressors they are under to receive funding and to receive acceptance to be federally recognized. Many statewide tribes are trying desperately to be supported by federal funds as well. But then we also have many state-supported tribes that want to solely work on their own. I think we have to have this conversation because many of us lived all in the same counties, communities, intersected, intermarried. There's a large population of Black and Native people here in North Carolina. And I think we have to really address the issue of oppression first. Because with this oppressive behavior that has been adapted by many Native communities, where we are seeing people who are non-Native Indigenous that are in leadership and in control, and do not want Black Native representation to be there, we have to take a stance on that as well. I think the presence is what's the issue for me. I know personally the reason I'm having this powwow is because I did not see anybody that looked like me, that could be head staff, that could be a representation of a jingle dancer, fancy shawl, or traditional dancer. I didn't see anybody that could be a grass dancer out there that looked like me. And then people were questioning people also about their tribal membership and their CIB numbers, which are asking them about their blood quantums and everything like that. And so to be that type of oppressive behavior to be inflicted upon you as being Black and Native in the midst of all of this racism, I think that's something we have to address. The oppressive behavior is the issue, because we have just as much racism in Native and Black communities as we do outside of it, and it needs to be addressed. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, so it's kind of speaking to that, like, what are some practical things? Because, like, you know, and I'm sure you all have been on panels and spoken in different places and things like that. And one of the things I always kind of grew frustrated with was, like, when we have these kinds of panels, like, what comes from it other than just everybody talking to each other, feeling, I guess, kind of cathartic in that moment, because we're all discussing things that we want to address, and we feel like somebody's hearing it for a change, you know, and like hearing our perspective or our experiences. But outside of that, like, what gets done from it, like what can actually grow from that. And so one of the challenges, I think, with this particular roundtable that I kind of want to put forward to everybody else is what are some things that, like, tangible things that we can actually start doing? Because there might be people watching this or maybe watch it later and say, like, well, I actually want to do something, but, you know, how do I address oppression? Like, I work at Walmart, like that's what pays my bills. And, you know, how can what is addressing oppression while being a sales associate? What does that look like, you know? So again, like, open to anybody.
I'd like to chime in real quick, since I was just talking about that. When I come to your powwow, say hello to me, welcome me. Don't disrespect me. Don't treat me disrespectful. When I support your tribal lands and I support your communities, embrace me. Don't ask me for my dad's tribal card or for my mother's tribal card. Embrace who I am and who my people are, and you knowing that their names are on your rosters. Respect that. I think also part of it too is, as an individual, one thing I've done is I have supported Native communities. I've made a point to do service projects to support Native communities. When I was in college, I joined a Native sorority. I was a part of a Native American organization on campus as well that was separate from the sorority. I made a point to become co-president of that sorority, to become in leadership, to be an example as the first openly Black and Native woman that served in that capacity. Also being a part of local community organizations that support Natives and African Americans. So I think there's just about taking time to connect with communities as well. But when we do connect, that we need to make sure that people are respectful. And we have to make sure, sometimes we have to put out our own respect. I've had some very derogatory things said to me about organizing this powwow, but my main focus is the 38,000 people that have liked that post and said, I will be there to support you. And those are the ones out of maybe 5 or 10 disrespectful comments I have to focus on, because there is a large spread across this nation of people that are standing in solidarity for Black Natives. And I think with oppression, we start with ourselves right there.
Absolutely.
You are not, you,
Oh.
go ahead, I'm sorry. I was getting ready to say, you and I are both from North Carolina, so we know how it is here, right? I'm from Southeastern North Carolina, down here in the Cape Fear region. When I speak about our ancestry, it makes people mad. They don't like the way we look. They don't like the colonial and historical records that support me for who I am. I can go into the records and I can show you that my ancestors in the Cape Fear region, known as Sea Breeze, belong to my family, all the way 70 miles inland, all the way into touching Robeson County. Our family, we have family members from Southern Virginia to northern South Carolina, and all points in between. But we're concentrated in southeastern North Carolina. Colonial records describes my family here as looking like Ethiopians or Africans with, and you've probably seen these quotes 1,000 times because I think, in my opinion, they're kind of misused because you have a lot of fanatics out there. I'm not coming from that standpoint. I'm just coming from basic research. There it is, family history, and we've been here, haven't gone anywhere. Our grandparents have told us about our native ancestry. Because of being cut off, we don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes. But according to today's standards, my ancestors from 1525 would be classified as African Americans today before they even mixed with Africans. Now, we're not negating the mix because Wilmington is a port city, and all of your port cities were breeding grounds for importation from people from the islands, from people from Africa, and so forth. So we have a very interesting mix from European, African, island, indigenous, American ancestry here. But when we speak about that, it makes people angry. We need to find a way to speak to people, or should I say, communicate with. I don't even. It's kind of hard because you can't sugarcoat the truth. You know, it is what it is. You can't sugarcoat it. But when I speak to it and you get angry, we can't move forward and past that to work on a lot of the things we need solutions to. One of the things that the brother was talking about, you know, what do we do? How do we get past this? What are some of the things we need to work on? Well, I heard a guy from one of the reservations in the Midwest said that a lot of the natives, even on the reservations, don't even know how to make arrowheads anymore. If Walmart was to close down, many people would starve because people don't know how to grow vegetables. They don't know how to hunt. They don't know how to make fishing traps. They don't know how to make the necessities to live off the land. This virus situation that we got going on has kind of forced some folks to kind of, start self-reflecting. I've seen a lot of that going on now. People are starting to put their hands in the dirt, starting to look into the different seed banks. We have native seed banks in North Carolina. The Skarure Katanawaka, Fix Kane, this guy is great when it comes to dealing with native seeds. He's a seed keeper. And he's connected to a network. Very easy. These connections, I think these platforms like what we're on now are great, and we need to plug them into other platforms and kind of get this dialogue going, try to get past the religious barriers. And I think if we can get past the religious barriers, we can kind of chisel away at that colorism thing, you know, because I think religion and colorism are kind of attached to each other a little bit. I mean, just my opinion. I think they're kind of attached. I have a cousin who's in his 70s. He was raised as a native, and he was discriminated against by Black people. I have one of my cousins who's passed away. She was in her 90s when she passed away. She was a medicine woman. She would go and pick dandelion, burdock, and all that stuff out of her yard. Other family members in the church would call her a witch doctor and didn't want to deal with her. If we could break down some of these religious barriers, which are really European values, in my opinion, as well. We hold a lot of European values really close to heart, and it causes us to be discriminatory. If we can break down some of those, like I would like to go to the church. I would like to go to some churches, and I would like to speak to my family members about our history, our shared ancestry, and how I love them regardless of what they believe. And and many times it's not reciprocated. You feel like you're kind of pushed to the side because you believe in that Indian stuff, roots and stuff. So, just my opinion. I like to hear what you all think about it.
Yeah, I think that thank you for that. My elder, Chief Reggie Caesar of the Montucket tribe here in Long Island, called me at the beginning of the pandemic to check on me, and he said, Sutton, right now is a time to, you know, to go back to our Indigenous ways, for those who are already practicing our Indigenous ways, you know, so spending time with nature, practicing ceremony, checking up on your elders, you know, caring for your neighbor. These are our Indigenous ways, you know, and that's how we operate, or we should be operating. And, you know, and he said, you know, you see those people that are, you know, hoarding toilet paper. Those aren't our ways, Sutton. He said, those aren't our ways. We don't do that. We care for each other, you know? And I said, absolutely, Elder, thank you, you know? And I think that's so important. And so I went on my platform and held just an Instagram live to talk about that, and just looking at these values, these Euro-American values that we're seeing play out right now in a pandemic, where we care more about Wall Street than we do, you know, care about just the health of our neighbor. Or, you know, I seen a video that went viral of just a young person taking toilet paper from an elder. I just disgusted me, you know, and I think right now is this time to pause, like you said, Chief, and to look within, and also to practice these Indigenous values. And if you don't know, I think it's a great time to do some research before you ask and put that burden on an Indigenous person. But I think to your point of, you know, what are the recommendations? What should people walk away from? I think that, you know, if you're wanting to be a good ally, I think it starts with first asking yourself, you know, what is your motivation? Is this to feed your ego? Is this to, do you think that this is an extracurricular activity? Because it's not. And if that's what you think, then this isn't for you, you know? And then it's to then start learning, start educating yourself. You know, there's this thing called Google that we can all access before, again, we, you know, slip into a DM of somebody and put that emotional burden on them. And then if we are going to ask someone, send them some money, send them a tip on Venmo, PayPal for their time, you know, if you can't take the time yourself. And I think that it's important to understand that you're never going to stop learning. So don't think that just because you attended a curriculum or a workshop or read, you know, somebody's dissertation or thesis, that it stops there. You're going to be continually learning throughout this process. And I think, again, checking in with yourself as well as on your motivations along the way is going to be really important. And that would just be my first tip or recommendation on what you might be able to do with the information you learned today, and how you can be an ally, or you can support, or you can help move the dialogue forward.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up on what you're saying, you know, I think it's important to go back to our stories and go back to our elders. You know, I think one of the things that happens when we get into these kind of conversations about who's more native than who's more authentic than whom, is we privilege the very kind of colonial things that have erased us to begin with, you know, instead of going back to our families and going back to the stories that have been passed down for generations, instead of connecting with folks in our community to build those relationships. So I think it's, you know, now more than ever, we're learning that we're deeply interconnected and that we fundamentally need one another. And so just taking stock of the kind of relationships that you have with folks, you know, what are your relationships like with your kin? What kind of ethics are you building with your community, right? Care, just at a fundamental level. How do you care for the folks that are in deep community with you, you know? And I think that's uncomfortable because it's unsettling. And I think it's gonna require loss too. It's gonna require us to kind of relinquish and chip away the parts of our identities and who we say we are that are attached to colonialism, that are attached to capitalism, that are attached to these things that do not serve us. And we're gonna lose some things in the process, right? But I'm hopeful and optimistic that we're gonna gain so much more in the process of doing that work.
You know, from a historical standpoint, let me see if I can grab this real quick. Hold on, y'all. In speaking of my own family, since we brought up a little bit of family history, I have been disappointed to a certain extent. I just want y'all to see this real quick. So can y'all see that a little bit? So this was taken, this picture is roughly around, or the drawing rather, in the late 1880s, from what the woman, who was my grandmother, Isabella Jones, from the memoir that she left us. She's Native, and she left the memoir. She died in 1915 on her way to church. and he was enslaved. He's an African-American male named Amos Talley, and they are out of Eastern, well, not Eastern, Warren County, North Carolina. So there is, of course, the Hallowasaponi tribe that is there. Right. So she left a memoir and talked about how African Americans, how Blacks would get off of the road when they saw her walking on the road, and that was, of course, out of respect at that time. And my great aunt, who passed recently, was her granddaughter, and she left all of these great things about her. Like, this is some pottery that she had made. So I've been kind of the torchbearer to keep all these different things in our family. And what always troubled me was sometimes in our family, they would always just want to say, well, it's Native, we're this the Native piece, the Native piece, the Native piece, and completely negating the African American piece. Like, you don't understand that, you know, yes, we have that tangible evidence. And I don't know how well some of these DNA tests are, but, you know, 23andMe, as well as what's the other one? Ancestry. I had my great aunt take that, and yes, it's there, you know, for whatever that may be worth. But to always hear whenever they reach out to me, well, since we're Native, can't we get some of that money, and this and that, this and that, this and that, and the ignorance in it, right? Because they don't really understand. So I had to educate them that yes, we have that, and that is part of who we are. However, you don't try to exploit what that looks like. You relish it. Here, let me send you the transcript that I have of the memoir that she left. Know who she is first, right? Before you get into all these other things that you want to do. But it's that westernized ideology to where you don't even want to claim your Blackness, right? Like it's not that I don't know if you're ashamed of it or what have you, to where it automatically makes you want to just look at the Native piece. Yeah, there is a Native aspect that's there. We get that. We know that. But you should not, of course, denounce your Blackness in light of appeasing this westernized culture to be everything but, right? And I think that goes back to what the brother was saying from a religious standpoint. A lot of people, they don't look at Black as being good to a certain extent. Even in my family, people talking about each other's hair back in the day, from an oral history that I was able to get. His granddaughter, one of my great aunt, she was talking, she says that one of his granddaughters would always be called that nappy head girl, right? All of her brothers and sisters had, you know, this coarse hair, but she would be called that nappy head girl. And she would often feel isolated. You know, her name was Sarah, my Aunt Sarah, great Aunt Sarah. You know, I never met her, of course, but I can only imagine from a mental health standpoint how that made her feel like an outsider, right? So I think that from a religious aspect of things, yes, it is very trying to try to be steeped in your faith, but then also understand that you have to take some things with a fine grain of salt and do research your own self and still choose the side of humanity over what's right and what's wrong. And you shouldn't demonize or make other people black sheep in your family solely because they don't abide by every single scripture that it is that your family has been risen upon, right? So just looking at things from a family history standpoint, as well as currently how religion has caused a divide to a certain extent in multiple families, is very important to look at. But we also cannot denounce who it is that we are, whether it's Black, whether it's Native, whether it's a mixture of both. Be happy of the comprised combination of everything in which you are.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I had a family member years ago, grandmother actually, on my mother's side, maternal grandmother. She used to tell me, she's passed away now, of course, a few years, but when I was a small child, I'm 38 now, approaching 39, she used to tell me, girl, you better mind out what you find. And I noticed that language continued on into some of my aunts. And it was about, at that time period in their life where they lived in Nash County, Warren County, Halifax County, that what you said was you were not Native. You said you were Black to be safe. There was, you know, a mark on your head if you said you were anything other than Indigenous, other than African American, and that you could possibly have some complications of being placed, quote unquote, they feared, on a reservation. So a lot of times I'm the granddaughter of a sharecropper / hog farmer, my mother's side, and construction worker on my father's side. And so I saw those issues that came into play. And I think for Black natives now that are going back through, like you said, the DNA testing, or they're doing the GED matches, or they're doing just Ancestry.com for the printed documents piece of it, where you're looking at documentation of birth certificates, death certificates, or marriage certificates. It's where you're starting to see the pieces of a puzzle come together, where you realize people had these stories of fearfulness in a time of Jim Crow and a depression, the Great Depression. You had all these systemic systems played against them as well. And to be Black and Native in America is a very trying situation. To be accepted, trying to be supportive and give acceptance into other groups is difficult sometimes. And that's why I'm glad we have basically not necessarily related to, but our own sense of community of Black natives. You're starting to see people that are Afro-Indigenous Black natives that are saying, hey, I'm also this, and this is like a small community that's growing. Every day I'm meeting new people that are saying that they're finding out through their ancestry, especially after the quarantine. A lot of people had time to really look and see what's going on their ancestry. So I commend everyone for being here on the panel today. And I definitely think that it's something that we have to talk about continuously.
Yeah, if I could also add in, you know, I definitely see like that the shunning or the anti-Blackness end of things. Cause like, I mean, you know, I used to teach, I student taught down at Robeson County in Maxton, North Carolina. And so like, you know, you would see some that, you know, some individuals that would, you know, they were very much like, okay, yeah, there was mixtures going on all the time in these communities. That's just kind of how it happened. And you had others that were like, look, I'm no N-word. Don't even come over me with that kind of stuff. You're like, and it was just like this stark contrast, depending on who you talk to, and just it ranged. It just really depended on the person. And I think that kind of also played out. Like I saw it in my own family history as well. Like, you know, there's the anti-Blackness element, but there was also almost like an anti-Native element to say that like, well, clearly those people think they're better than us, or linking yourself to them makes it seem as if you're elevating yourself in displaying the anti-Blackness. So we're not talking about any of that. And even to the point of erasure. So like there's members of my family, they're like, well, you know, yeah, they said they were Indian, whatever, you know, that's just another way of them trying to say that they're better. And so it was just like, you know, this kind of dismissal of that end. But I also think there's a competing kind of longing for that connection, because that's the closest thing to finding out like your African ancestry. Your African ancestry is very difficult to figure out. In some cases, you know, your African ancestor came across what, 500 years ago almost. So I mean, you know, it's hard to make that connection. So then when you actually find a closer connection that's more recent, you might want to latch on to that because at least it's something. And I think it's just like these kind of competing elements, but one of them is rooted in an institutionalized format, which is the anti-Blackness. And it's just, how does that play out amongst each individual, you know? And so like, you know, there's very institutional element to it. Like I know I'm on my father's side, for instance, we're from Virginia on that side. And Virginia had a very distinct way of handling their Native communities and erasing their Native communities that kind of spread amongst other states, but was very much a Virginia thing. And, you know, where you had people's marriage records and vital records just altered or destroyed. And in the second that they, you know, married somebody who was considered African or African descent, then they were no longer Native, and everybody after that was no longer Native. You were not allowed to be on the lands because that jeopardized everybody else in the community. So it was almost like, to safeguard the rest of the community, you do this, or to distance that person, you know, that way, like you help, you know, make your environment more cohesive. But there's still this anti-Blackness element that's on an institutional element, on an institutional level, but that also gets kind of internalized on a social level. And I think that's probably, for me, one of the things ARC has had to navigate. You know, we've had to navigate directly or indirectly in terms of how we, do things or how we approach certain topics. So I kind of want to see, what do you guys think about, just with that anti-Blackness element, and even the anti-Native element, like how do we navigate that effectively?
I think some people may not know, they may not be educated enough of each culture to be able to fully embrace it. You know what I'm saying? I think that some of it comes from a complete lack of education and the stereotypes in which they see on TV. I mean, I was born in 79, I'm 40 now, 40. So when I watched things on Native Americans on TV, whether I was watching Bonanza or some of those Wild West, movies, because I'm an old soul, I looked at back then as natives as being savages, right? I mean, that's what was given, right? And it wasn't until later on in life to where I started doing my own research, and I had some friends that were Native growing up there in Tennessee, that it gave me a completely different perspective of it, right? So I think that with regards to, because to a certain extent, it's some sense of self-hate to a certain extent, that you have to educate yourself about these different communities, not only your own communities, but other communities as well, so you can gain a greater appreciation for that humanity aspect of things, is also gain an appreciation from all those cultures. So now that you've done this research, or you've done DNA, et cetera, now it's your time, the ball's in your court, to embrace all of that and to educate others about what that actually means. You should not hate yourself more because you have more Native in your blood than African in your blood, or vice versa, or white in your blood versus that. You have to be able to create it all. I think it's a beautiful mixture, and that's why we all come in these different beautiful skin colors that we have, right? It's a beautiful thing, but you have to be able to understand and research how you got to that point in order to be able to actually embrace it, right? So I think that it's a lack of education, and it's a lack of it's a lack of embracing who it is who you truly see in the mirror on a daily basis. And we got to get back to loving ourselves more, because when you love yourself more, then you'll spread that love around, and it doesn't matter what that person look like or what the blood quantity that you have is. So that's my opinion on at least how to start, what that process looks like.
Yeah, and I would just like to speak to that, because, just my own personal testimony, I was raised between the Menominee and the Oneida reservations in Wisconsin. My grandfather, who we've never met, is Irish and Scottish, and my grandmother is Menominee and Oneida. My mother is a white passing Native, which was difficult for her growing up on the reservation. And I'm the first to be mixed with African, ancestry. Which was difficult for me looking back. I don't think I mean, just like Kimberly said, nobody looks like me. I was a jingle dress dancer, growing up, and I was the only one out there with curly hair. And I knew that I was different. Everybody had this bone straight hair. But I was very proud, to grow up in my culture and to know that, my grandfathers were the last chiefs of the Menominee tribe, Chief Oshkosh, and it wasn't until, and I didn't grow up with my father either. I actually never had met him until 2 years ago, when I was reconnected with that side of my family on Facebook. And I actually went down to where they're from, Mobile, Alabama, to discover that my father's family comes from Africa Town. And so to find that knowledge and to understand what that means, coming from Africa Town, and perhaps maybe being a descendant of the last slave ship that came into America, the Coltida, I believe that was the ship. Yeah. Now I'm starting to connect more with the Black side of me. And that's why it's very important for me to say I'm Afro-Indigenous. I find that so liberating and find so much power in that. And I'm just so happy that since I have been, really communicating that on my platform and saying I'm Afro-Indigenous and walking in that truth and being proud and doing more research on both ends of who I am, I'm starting to be connected with other Afro-Indigenous peoples who have those same similar stories, who understand what it's like. I was talking to my grandmother about, hey, why did we stop going to Thanksgiving at Uncle Marty's house, or, whatever? And she said, oh, it's because he had a problem that my grandchildren were mixed with Black, so we stopped going there. And I never knew that growing up. That was just, my grandma was like, oh, okay, we're not doing, Thanksgiving over there anymore. But to look back and start to think about some of the comments that were made and how a lot of my Native relatives were and are anti-Black, and having to educate them because I kind of threw a wrench in that lineage being Black. But I just wanted to echo what the brother said about, researching, your ancestry and understanding what that means. And for me, I've found just so much power and confidence and really finding out who I am on both ends. Again, I'm just very much so rooted and know who I am as a Native person, but it's really important for me now to really understand who I am as a Black woman.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a lot of power in being able to claim who you are, all of yourselves, right? And to me, that's a political act. That's a deeply political act to say, these are all of myselves, and I claim all of myselves, even in the face of these colonial structures that say, I'm gonna tell you who you are, right? I'm gonna tell you about your people and where you came from. And I think for me, being able to do that work, it took a long time. There's still wounds that come from being able to say that I'm Black and Indigenous, Waro Lokono. Like there's a particular way too, when I'm in Indigenous spaces, that I have to navigate anti-Blackness and the complicity with whiteness. And it's a complicity because sometimes it's unconscious, right? And sometimes it's in the kind of veiled comments that on the surface don't seem anti-Black, but when you dig deeper, like it's there at the core of it. But growing up, it was really just connecting to my father's stories, and my father being able to connect to my Waro Lokono community through my father, who was the first Black and Amerindian child in his community in Guyana, in South America, where he experienced all types of, feelings of ostracization from the community for being Black and Amerindian. And it's interesting for me, and I think I'm just trying to think about the point that was made earlier about how do we build bridges. It's also for folk in the US to understand there's a broader global context of anti-Blackness and Indigenous erasure, and that across the Americas, right? And so these logics, they're transnational, they work together, they're not incidental, right? So the same stories that we are seeing here in the US with the erasure of Native folk is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean context. And so I think part of the work is broadening our horizons outside of a US context so that we can see the connections, so that we can see the kind of ongoing history that this story really is.
And I think for me, with my family growing up, for my father's family, it was always the question of where was his Indigenous background and his roots. And when we would talk about, just when I was a child, about why I was learning this particular language, why I was going to this particular reservation, why am I visiting these particular people, it became very present to me even at an early age, as early as like 8 years old. Like, this is part of your heritage. I want you to know, as well as be very happy and accepting of that you're also African American, that your grandmother's people come from the Ivory Coast, that this is where your descendants are coming from, and knowing both and appreciating both. And for me, it was such a beautiful experience. And then when I started researching my mother's family, not too long ago, it's been a couple years now that I've been researching her maternal and paternal side. And I'm finding now that I'm researching her paternal side, I'm seeing a lot of, like we said, Hallowasaponi people area, Halifax, Warren, Nash County area, seeing people that are connected. And one thing that I've noticed is in a lot of communities, especially when I was in college in the sorority, many times I would see the girls do things I've been doing for years. Whether it was the beadwork, whether it was the food we prepared, whether it was the music we listened to, whether it was the traditional dances we did, whether it was the ribbon skirts we made, whether it was regalia we made. And then it was like the dots are connecting. more and more. And I noticed that my grandmother would start naming some of us different names that meant something in their language. But she would always say that she was African American or Black on her census, or she was labeled as mulatto many a times on her census, which is something, another deeper question is with the census. We all know that's a deeper issue as well. Because there wasn't always a time where there was self-identification. But when I started noticing, connecting the dots, it led me back to listening to her stories about being careful about reaching back too far, because you're going to find something you don't need to see, to now coming forward and realizing this is everything I needed to see. And this is why I do the things that I do. This is why you made those certain teas, why you made these certain foods, why you listened to this certain music, why you did this certain dance, why you, when granddaddy's out in the field praying for rain, this is why his rain dance is this way to the creator. This is why you have called God creator. But when I see you at church in, you know, a more congregated capacity, it may say God, but I don't ever hear you mention other certain things of oppressive behaviors I've seen other people do in church situations. I see you always saying creator of all things, great spirit. So just those little hints is what I want to encourage people watching today. Really listen, because sometimes it may be hidden in plain sight, exactly what your elders are trying to tell you. They just were a little bit fearful of it being documented back when they were in a very oppressive situation. But now you have a lot more freedom, still a lot of issues, but a lot more freedoms to look further back. Mm-hmm.
What I hear a lot of you saying is it's all about loving yourself. I'm gonna tell you a few things that my teachers told me. Your greatest enemy is yourself. The greatest foe that you will ever fight is yourself, because people are pinned on the mat every day by their own egos. So it's a constant battle trying to submit your own ego. So you are your greatest enemy. And the greatest space in the universe is the space between your ears. The scriptures, if you're into, if you acknowledge and subscribe to that, it says that the kingdom is within you. So you have to turn within you. When you can embrace every part of you that makes you uniquely who you are, that's a powerful thing when you have to deal with this European colonial value system that we have to deal with every day. Because if you go out and say you're native, the first thing they're going to ask you, what's your percentage? Are you recognized? They're going to ask you all these box questions to put you in the box to try to make you less than what you are. When you can recognize all the cultures that's floating around in your DNA, in your blood, to make you who you are, it makes you a dynamic individual when you have to go out there and deal with people. I had a conversation with an ex-Klan member, actually, and it was very interesting. He was talking to me about how his great-grandfather owned slaves. And I'm gonna get, if I hope I don't forget, because my train of thought, man, it'll just run all over the place sometimes. Hope I can get back to that word slaves. But anyway, this ex-Klan member was telling me how his grandfather used to treat his slaves very nice. They were treated well. And he said, I worked out there on the farm with the slaves, and I worked just as hard as they did. So I don't really see what the big deal is. Because I'm confident in myself, I asked him, I said ex-Klan member, so we had a very open conversation. I asked him, I said, do you mind if we have a open conversation, no sugarcoating? I'm gonna be honest with you. He said, yeah. And I told him, we were straightforward. He tried to deny my native ancestry, said, well, you look like you're just a Negro to me. And I said, well, sir, you probably have just as much Negro as I do. When you're able to embrace every part of you, you can deal with these kind of folks out there, because they're going to come at you left and right. They're going to come at you all the time. The word slave, loving yourself. Let me get to that right now. A lot of people don't love themselves because they hate the word slave, because they make you feel like your history began with slavery. You were a slave, that's all you were, that's all you came from. I like to use enslaved, not slave, because our ancestors were enslaved. If you're talking about Africans and if you're talking about natives, they were enslaved, not just slaves. Slaves is not who they were and not who they are. If people understood history and understood every part about them, they would understand that the enslaved folks, our ancestors, they didn't just sit there and take that. There's rebellions, there's rebellions that's not even talked about. Right here in Wilmington, the race riots, even before the race riots. And I hope you don't mind me saying, I just say the N-word instead of saying what the N-word is. There was a road here, please, I'm gonna say it, Niggerhead Road. And I apologize if I'm offending anybody by saying that. There was a road here called Niggerhead Road. There was a rebellion that was inspired by Nat Turner. Nat Turner was inspired by David Walker from Wilmington, who wrote The Appeal. The Appeal, David Walker wrote The Appeal because he was pissed with seeing people who looked like him being subjugated and treated the way they were being treated. He left Wilmington, went to Charleston, seen how they were being treated inhumane, came back to Wilmington. He wrote that appeal. It circulated, and it inspired Nat Turner to do what he did. So that's when all your European people were just on walking on eggs at that time. So we all know the story about Nat Turner, how that turned out. Well, there's another rebellion that started right here in our region, but it never escalated to where it was going because somebody sold out the leaders of the rebellion, and it was cut off before it can get started. But there was over 2,000 people who was marching to Wilmington, and they said they was going to take out everybody in sight, minus the women and children. They was really going after these slave masters. That's who they were going after. But because somebody sold them out, they were able to cut it off before it reached its height. So what did the Europeans do? They beheaded them, just like they did the chief of the King Philips. That's an old history going back to Europe. They beheaded our people here, stuck their heads on stakes. The road now is called Point Peter. The people, they changed the name of the road because they want to hide this history. It was called Niggerhead Road, going all the way to Moores Creek Battlefield off of Highway 53. They placed these heads on stakes as a warning to all you others who even think about trying to raise up. But guess what? They still kept raising up and raising up and raising up. People are not taught this stuff. They're taught to be ashamed of our enslaved ancestors. They're never taught about the code languages. We hear about the code talkers and their contributions to the military. We had code talkers too. The old Negro spirituals were code songs. Crossing the Jordan, Going Over Yon, all those songs about escaping and moving and going up north. These things that they were taught, I would suggest. I heard you talking about Ancestry and 23andMe, and I'm going to end this in a second. I would suggest I'm a senior ambassador for the House of Ancestry, and there's a lot of things that I've learned in there dealing with African ancestry, Native ancestry, ancestry from India, European, and the complete mix in America, because a lot of folks came here and we bear the phenotypes of all those mixings that took place. That's why we look a little different from a lot of folks everywhere. I will suggest, if you're trying to really get deeper and finding the African connections, to go on social media, look up the House of Ancestry and connect there. The director is Chief Langley. He's I would say he's an excellent researcher and genealogist, and he's been able to show me some things I didn't even know was there and that existed. I'm also a member of FANA, the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. We get a lot of folks contacting the Director General, because he's the face of FANA, looking for help trying to find Native ancestry, but that FANA's not that type of organization. If you're looking for Native ancestry and trying to find where you fit in, if you have African, if you have Native, I would suggest, contacting the House of Ancestry. And if you do have Native ancestry and you are able to connect with a tribe in your area and where you're from, then reach out to FANA and see if there's any assistance there. But self-love is where it's at.
I just want to follow up on that too. Oh, Sutton, did you want to? Okay. So I just wanted to follow up on a point that's being made, and I feel like folks are talking about it in relationship to enslavement and Black folk and Indigenous folk. It's like there's a deep wound, there's a deep wound that on the one hand, that, at the individual level, we can do that by affirming ourselves, loving ourselves with our practices, but that it's also brings into question the kind of politics and care that we're going to have in relationship as a community as a whole. So I'm really curious to hear how folks are thinking about this question of like a radical care really between Black and Native folks as collectives, and not just at the level of individuals, because we can get in a whole conversation about self-care and the way that has been, commercialized and capitalized and all those things. But in a rooted way, what are some of the things that people are doing to have this kind of collective healing between our communities?
And I think it goes back to what Chief said about, changing our language to when we're when we're referring to our ancestors and saying enslaved versus slave, because I believe that it really does shift the responsibility onto our oppressors. And I think that's really important. And I think that when we change the way we talk about it and the language we use, there can be a lot of healing mentally and emotionally from that.
Yeah, and just to maybe switch up gears a little bit too, we're getting some comments from YouTube and all that stuff. So I have a couple questions. One kind of is going back to what we were originally discussing at the very top regarding current events. How do we work together to break down systemic racism and structural violence that cross both into the Black and Native communities? For instance, the COVID numbers being disproportionate to some degree, depending on how you look at the numbers, but being adversely affected amongst African American and Native American communities, as well as criminalization within policing, within a more militarized police force. How do we kind of work together to break down those structural violent elements?
I think that, not only showing up for different protests, whether it's MMIWG or Standing Rock or the Keystone Pipelines or Black Lives Matter, or, I think it's beyond that. I think we need to collaborate on research. I think we have to lead our own initiatives. I think that we have the solutions to our community problems, our public health crises. And I think that we have to be the leaders, and we have to step up, and we have to work together to answer those issues that we're seeing in our communities, and not let others that are non-POC or Black, Indigenous, people of color lead those initiatives. And I think that's, advocacy and activism can look different in a number of ways. And so I just also, I see a lot of youth and individuals and peers my age who think that the only way is to be out in the streets. And that's great, show up, be out in the streets, I'm all for that. But, as I get older, my activism's starting to look a lot differently. And I'm starting to do a lot more research and, programming and facilitate conversations. And I think that's another way that we can show up for each other.
Yeah, I think that there's an urgency.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a profound urgency that folks are feeling, and that agreeing with you, Sutton, is that the answer is not going to come from looking to someone outside of our communities to save us. There's countless intellectuals and writers, Audre Lorde, who have said this, that our salvation is not going to come from someone outside of our communities. And I think just in a practical, everyday sense, what measures are we implementing in our everyday lives to show care to our communities, to protect our communities, even as we have states and governors who are opening up states here in Georgia, elsewhere, as the cases are continuing to go up, Alabama, as these cases are spiking, and as we're going to continue to see a spike through the summer, like what practices can we put in place for our communities, for one another, to show care, to show protection for each other as we navigate this? Because there's many variables. It's a moving situation. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty right now, but I know that when I go outside, I can put a mask on, you know, at just like a basic level. So things like that.
I think that things from a like a stress level standpoint, Stephen, when you asked, you know, kind of like some of the things that we do, Stephen, we met when at William & Mary College. My first documentary is titled "The American South as We Know It," and as a therapist, I had to mend my passion as well as what I learned technically in order to, you know, get my message across to people. So I created a presentation titled "Utilizing Film to Better Understand Historical Trauma in the African American Community," because people don't understand that this trauma is lodged deeply within our DNA. And because they don't understand that, they can't actually name what it is that they're bothered with. You know, some people look at natives and they look at African Americans and they may see us hanging out on the corner at 8 o'clock in the morning with the brown bag with some liquor in it and just thinking that you know, they're alcoholics, right? I mean, but they don't understand that that person has a diagnosis. That person has has been misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed, and they're coping with things the best way that they can, right? So it's very important that whatever skill that you have, whatever piece of art that you have that you're putting out there, if you can compare that with some type of intellectual presentation, some type of communication, that it will go that much further with regards to you reaching multiple communities. Because I put out that film in 2018 and I still have people asking, you know, well, this thing about historical trauma that you talked about and how it affects Black and Brown people, how does X, Y, and Z play into that? And then with the new documentary, I went into Native communities, African American communities, and white communities, discussing how race has affected us over the generations and what does reconciliation actually look like. And for some people, they don't have an answer for it. And that was the purpose of doing it, because some people don't have answers for some of these things, right? But then other individuals were saying, well, for me, it looks like this, or for me, it looks like that. So then for people who don't know, then that gives them options, right? It doesn't mean that they have to adopt it 100%, but they can formulate something of their own by after hearing something from a fellow person that may look like them, that they may not have even thought about even having a conversation. So I think that we have to utilize our skill sets. We are not monolithic. We are not one-trick ponies. We have multiple different ways to educate individuals. And I personally feel like Black and Brown people, and when I say Black and Brown people, I'm again saying African Americans, Natives, Indigenous, there's nobody better fit to do this. Because the reality is we ain't even supposed to be here. Who can survive everything that we've had to survive over all these years? Like, seriously, think about it. Who better fit in this country to survive everything in which we're doing now, right? We're not supposed to be here, right? I mean, if you really think about it, the food deserts, the different experiments that have happened upon us, Black and Indigenous women's bodies utilized without any type of anesthesia to numb their bodies through all these different surgeries to pick your bodies apart, the rape, I mean, it's just so much, right? But we're still here. So to me, I'm gonna take advice from y'all before I take it from anybody else, because of the simple fact, for you still to be here today, you done figured out something, right? So I just hope that people utilize their skill set, what they've learned educationally, what have come down from an ancestry standpoint, spiritually, et cetera. I think that will move the needle forward, and also allowing people to be who they are. If a person wants to wear dreadlocks, let them wear the dreadlocks. If they want to wear a mohawk, let them wear a mohawk. Whatever they want. If they want to color their hair orange, red, and green, let them do that, because we know that it looks different for people who look like us versus other folks. For other folks, it's artistic. For us, it's ghetto, right? And so we have to break down those barriers and not also criticize people for doing that within our own cultural groups, because the fact of the matter is, if it was someone else, you wouldn't be saying that. That's my personal opinion. Yeah.
I just wanted to say also, when you talked about, people are angry and they don't know why, or you see people out in the corner, drinking, and they say, oh, they're alcoholic. Well, what we're really seeing are trauma symptoms, right? What's happening when we let unresolved historical trauma carry on for so long without acknowledgement and the critical pieces of support that are necessary to heal. And I think that it's really important to drive that point, because we have so many angry youth right now who don't understand why they're triggered, why they're upset, why they're out there, being violent. And I think it's important to also understand on a biological level that, historical trauma, is woven into our DNA. There's so much research that demonstrate that we carry, this trauma through generations. And I think it's important that we understand how that shapes us, whether that's, these traumatic, events that shape our amygdala, and how that has an effect on our fight and fright response, systems, and our nervous systems and things like that. And I think that when we start to look in and understand our history and the traumas that our ancestors before us have experienced, it kind of puts those pieces of the puzzle together, like Kimberly was talking about, to better understand ourselves, to love ourselves, and understand why we feel the way we do when these injustices are happening all around us. So just a thought I had.
Yeah, and I'm hearing what both of you have said. And I keep coming back to a conversation that I was having yesterday about what do we do with the rage that we feel? Because we know that rage is not permissible. It's not allowed, right? Even our rage and our which is sacred, which is righteous, which is justified, even that is policed. So I'm thinking about, as we're having this conversation, what does it mean for us to talk about the rage that we feel, of the continual violences that we're subjected to, and what are some of the ways that folks, like, what are you doing to process the rage that you're feeling?
For me, when it comes to the divisiveness that you see sometimes, whether it's in tribal communities or African American communities, for me, whenever the rage is felt, I get inspired and very creative. So I also write for Sheen and Essence Magazine. I've written and contributed to both of them. I'm one person that really loves to write. I'm also the founder of a blog, the Lux Blog NC. And one thing that I always tell my readers is to always take that pain and move into creativity. So for me, it's been about, okay, if I'm not going to beg you for acceptance, I'm going to create my own safe space, which is why Black Indians NC started on Facebook a few months ago. And that's why a powwow with a full council of very diverse people that are tribally enrolled and some that are not, that are speaking their voices about why this representation is important. So I think even as individuals, those are things we can do, create your own lane, create a safe space. And just like we're doing today, my platform is connecting with another platform that has very similar interests. And so it's about connecting those spaces together. And that's when that rage does come, we do need to have these talks, and we do need to make sure that we are respectful of one another and giving safe space to people so they feel welcome to it. But I'm hoping that there are many, I know I've tagged many today. I hope there are many people from Native communities as well as African American communities tuning in to really see how people are truly feeling when they come from both backgrounds and honestly do know what that means to them. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
And also, I wanted to address a comment that was made earlier in the chat. I guess this is more in reference to what Chief Eagle was discussing, with saying we don't have to engage with KKK logic to talk about internal things with Black/Native folks. Now, I personally kind of feel like, well, the uncomfortable truth in a lot of this is that when talking about African American and Native American people, is that we're intertwined with European Americans, period. Like genetically speaking, like ethnically speaking, as well as culturally and socially. So like, you know, whether or not you endorse, whether or not you support, whether or not you, you know, I think that's a little bit different. But when you're actually discussing the logic, I think it is important to understand how people create the worlds in which they exist, in which the world that they use to then oppress or subjugate or manipulate people of color in different capacities. So it's like understanding the logic is a lot different than endorsing or supporting or providing a more of a power over you. But understanding it, I think, is probably fundamental to being able to better understand yourself, by understanding, in some cases, the worst of us, but then also by understanding how the power dynamic moves, the different iterations and different ways that it kind of can come together or develop. I think it's very important to understand that logic. Now, what you do with it afterward, I think, is the fundamental question. But understanding it, I think, is imperative for all of us to do. Then also, there's another question dealing with what happens when they don't claim us back. And I'm assuming this means, well, actually, it appears to be both on both ends, not being Black enough or not being Native enough for others within those communities, even though we might accept ourselves. So what do you do when that happens? So if you guys want to field that a little bit.
What do they do when they don't claim us back? Well, what have I done when they haven't claimed me back is I go to folks that do. I go to my family. I go to my elders. I go to my family stories. And I know that at the end of the day, you know, this particular person who does not accept me or embrace me does not trump the inheritance and the legacy that I come from and the ancestors that continue to walk with me. And so you're going to be moving in spaces at certain times where people are not going to be able to see you in your fullness. That's a fact, you know, whether it is people who look like you or people who don't look like you. But at the end of the day, I know there's a particular power in being able to say that this is who I am, regardless of whether or not you see me. And in that, there's a particular refusal, right? A refusal to see oneself through the lens of somebody else. And that is transformative, you know? And that's an ongoing life practice too.
We accept you.
I'm just gonna say, you know, I think that thinking about, you know, what do you do if they don't claim you? You know, I always think about what my mother tells me, and she always tells me, practice the 4 agreements. And, you know, number 1, don't take it personal. And I think it's really important. And it's very hard not to take it personal. But like you said, it's really important to remember your ancestors who walked behind you, you know, and to remember the family and the friends who do support you and who love you and who see you for you. And understanding that that person or those people who can accept you, they may be projecting something onto you that they can't, you know, be at peace with within themselves, you know. So just remembering, you know, I always say, for every one auntie who doesn't accept me, I've got 10 aunties who do. So
I think for me, I'll give 2 examples. So when it comes to people not from my area that I may be meeting just in travels or in different conferences or events, things like that, it becomes that talk of, well, which are you going to claim? Which are you going to accept? You're, you know, a fair-skinned woman, you know, my hair is straighter. It's like, I notice more natives are more accepting to me that may not be from my community area. It's the whole impression of you have to make a choice. And I always say, I don't have to make a choice because I'm both, and I'm proud of both. And both have made me an incredible woman who has done incredible things. And that's who I am. And I don't need your acceptance for that. So yes, snaps. Now, when it comes to people from my area that are from Eastern North Carolina or lived away and moved back and are back with family, if someone walks up to me, whether it's at a powwow or whether it's at any type of event that might be about African Americans and Native Americans, and people question my background or say something, the first thing I say, well, who's your people? And then I say, oh, and they'll say, oh, well, my such and such is this surname. You know, surnames is one of them strong words people like to use in tribal communities. My surname is such and such and such and such. And I'm like, oh, great. Well, guess what? That's my great great aunt. Hello, cousin. So, you know, and that's when we have some very interesting dialogue. And, oh, your grandmother does those things, so does mine. Your family does those things, so does mine. Oh, wait a minute, your family married into who? Oh, great. Well, then this is also the family my family married into. And then we many a times have realized we related in some distant way. And then we walk away both appreciative of the conversation and of the time. And then it's a realization of, yes, you may have grown up on the res. Yes, you may have lived an experience which you feel is an authentic Native experience that was provided for you by a system that is oppressing you. But when it comes to my situation, I am a survivor too, just like you survived and your generations have made it and survived the oppression you've been through, the genocides, and also being placed on reservations and other harsh situations that have happened to your people, so have mine, on both ends of the spectrum. Imagine having to deal with both of your sides of your ancestry had to deal with oppression and enslavement or disrespect. And then that's when you see the empathy come out in some people. And then some people are very accepting of their oppressive behavior and they prefer to stay in that safe zone because they don't want to be ousted or ostracized by other people they feel are supportive of them of being Native. So you come into some tricky things because, you know, I'm in the rural South. So you're coming into some tricky areas when it comes to that. But that's why a girl's got a master in social work. She wants to help heal some people.
You know, I've always I've never even really acknowledged the Native piece until really about 3 years ago when I had my great aunt take the DNA test, because, you know, you often hear in African American families, well, we got Cherokee, boom, 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 you hear that. And also in white families, they always throw that in there. But I'm more of a guy that likes to have some evidence, right? So it wasn't until like 3 years ago when I had my great aunt, the granddaughter of the lady in the picture I told you, she took the DNA test. We took 3 different ones because I wanted to make sure it was as accurate as possible, and it was. So I'm like, all right, cool. Now we know this, but I still, of course, identify myself as an African American male because for 37 years up until that point, that's just what I've identified with. Versus knowing from an oral history standpoint in the memoir that that Isabella was Native, and it wasn't until I was down in Lumberton. I was at UNCP and I did a presentation down there screening the documentary, and I got some good friends that are Lumbee. And you know, we were just shooting the breeze, and I said, "Yo, man, I took the DNA test or what have you." And he was like, "Oh, okay, cool. What came of it?" And I was like, "Well, it says this." You know, I showed him the results from from the phone and everything, and then I showed him the memoir, and he said, "Okay, you're Native. That Native blood. You don't need to prove anything else. Like that's just what it is." And that was it. And we just moved on to the next subject, right? So to the question that's saying that what happens if they don't accept you, and it's not that I was even looking for acceptance. I was just sharing information because again, I've just functioned as an African American male or have shown up as that for all these years. I didn't go no further than that. I haven't really discussed it. I haven't been trying to announce that I have this blood in me. I found my tribe, if you will, right? I got that one person that saw the information, said that, okay, you're good to go, and boom. Not that I needed that to validate me. It was just something to have someone that was cognizant enough to look at what's right there in front of them and not ask me what tribe, what card, because I don't know the tribe. She didn't leave that in her memoir. She just gave everything else, right? So I have none of that. I just know the region that they're from. So outside of that, I don't know. But, you know, sometimes we can't seek approval from everyone else to determine our individuality. Get yourself a couple of people that you know have some good common sense, share information, keep going with living your best life afterwards. So that's what I've done.
Yeah, now I would like
I
to
agree.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying too. And I also I'm thinking about, you know, a bigger question and related maybe question is, when we do find ourselves secure in who we are as individuals, as our identities, what does that look like? How does that translate in your everyday life? You know, more than, because we have folk who are Native who are doing all types of stuff, right? We have folks who are Black who are doing and participating in all types of stuff. So what does that mean, you know, in an everyday life, to say that you're Native, to say that you're Black, you know, and how is that showing up in the way you live your life? You know, what kind of practices do we have? What kind of ethics do we have with one another? What kind of relationships do we have to the land, to water? You know, to me, what beyond someone coming up and saying that they identify as Black or Afro, Indigenous or Native, it's like, what is your practice? Like, how are you living your life? You know, and I think at a deep level, that's a question that it's an ongoing question, an ongoing work that we're all participating in.
Okay, so I guess we can spend the next few minutes just, if we can go one by one, just discussing some of the things you guys are doing right now, as well as resources that people could utilize that you might be aware of, or that you create or have out there that people could also utilize. We're going to put all of that together onto the AARCC website, arc.org, and we'll have this video also embedded in there, as well as the extended bios for each participant, and then a little section over for everything that you guys discussed. So any kind of links, whatever, and we'll have a more comprehensive list. But maybe if you guys just want to each share, we'll just go one by one, whoever wants to go first.
You all mind if I go first? I have a 4 o'clock client. I'm still seeing people as a counselor on a Saturday. I got to make money, y'all. If y'all don't mind me going first, I appreciate it. I'm still, well, prior to COVID, I was booked doing a whole lot of things in very different communities. With the first film, it's titled The American South as We Know It. And what I did was I traveled throughout the South East for about a year and a half, interviewing individuals about their specified experiences during Jim Crow. So it's an educational piece, and it's people that look like your grandmother and your grandfathers, your great grandmothers and great grandfathers, the janitors and nurses that you may have known that took care of you while you were elderly, while you were young and they were elderly. I wanted to just get a comprehensive understanding in various different parts of the Southeast, what Jim Crow looked like, because it looked different in Mississippi than it did in Tennessee, right? It wasn't something that was monolithic across the board for everyone. So that's something that I'm still doing online sessions with different groups, organizations, giving the presentation, utilizing film to better understand historical trauma in the African-American community. The next thing that I have up is my new documentary, The Other Side of the Coin, Race, Generations, and Reconciliation. And we were supposed to have the premiere for that documentary at the end of next month, end of June, in Durham, North Carolina. But unfortunately, due to COVID, we canceled that. So I'm trying to figure out when to actually release it. And again, with that documentary, visited Native communities, African-American communities, and white communities across the span of generations, asking the questions with regards to how race has affected them, not only them, but how they've seen it affect other groups. What does reconciliation look like? If they have an answer to what that looks like, then of course to share that so other individuals can kind of glean from that and develop something for themselves. So that's some of the things that I'm doing. I'm going to also include a presentation around that's obviously focused on race, and you can find that information, the trailer for that one, and you can also find the American South as We Know It. My website is historybeforeus.com. That's historybeforeus.com, and on all social media, historybeforeus.com. So I just want to say I thank you all for inviting me to this. Hopefully it provides an opportunity for us to collaborate. Some of us are all here in North Carolina, so that I'm always willing to hit the road, you know what I'm saying, claim that good money on taxes through the LLC, right? You know, we got to be very enterprising with how we do things, you know what I'm saying, as Black folks, you know, we got to get ahead of the game too. So I have all of you all's information, I believe, and I look forward to staying in touch. And thank you all for having me. I hate to go. I would love to hear what you all say, but I'll follow up and look at this again and get everyone's information. So I appreciate it, you all.
Thanks for joining us again, as always.
All right.
Thank you for joining.
All right, be safe.
Take care.
Thank you.
Nice talking to you.
Yeah,
All right, brother.
thank you.
All right, so I guess Kimberly, if you want to go next.
Yeah, so for me, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. To me, today's discussion is truly dedicated to my ancestors and to my family. I know many of them got to tune in, so I'm hoping they really enjoyed and embraced the content today. So for me going on is we have the Black Indians NC Powwow that is scheduled right now for September 2020, but we are postponing to 2021. So currently right now, we are still taking vendors. We do have a Facebook page as well as an event page that's on Facebook, which is Black Indians NC Powwow and Black Indians NC. And so we welcome people to come and check out those social media groups. We're going to start talking about some really great works that we're going to be talking about historically facts about Black natives, as well as talking about things leading up to the powwow, our vendors, and so much more. So those are some really key things that I'm working on, as well as continuing my community relationships with the tribes all over North Carolina and beyond. So I want to thank you for today. And also I want to dedicate this talk today to my beloved mother who is deceased. And my mother's family, I've been finding out, is very connected to the Halawasaponi people that was mentioned earlier. So I have been researching her family background, and I want to dedicate this talk today to her. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that as well. I appreciate that. Dr. Cordes?
Yes, Shania. So a lot of my work facilitating conversations is actually at the intersections of, the experiences of Black and Indigenous communities. And so I've done that with students. I've done that in community organizations, with my own work in Guyana, in my own communities, doing those kinds of workshops. And then, of course, in my courses that I teach here at Spelman College. And I think like an extension of that work is right now I'm working on a book that is looking at the intersections of enslavement and indentureship and Indigenous dispossession in the Caribbean, and then also across the Americas.
All right. Chief Eagle Elk, you wouldn't mind just telling us like some of the things you're involved in, and things that we also could link to towards the like on our homepage that people can just use as resources to learn more.
Okay. Well, we have a new website up. Our old site, we're doing away with that. So we have a new website up and we're still adding to it. So there's going to be some links I'm going to be adding. One of the links is going to be the House of Ancestry. That's the one I mentioned a little earlier. That's a great resource, lots of information, and it's information from around the world, dealing with African, dealing with Native, dealing with Indian from India, not America. So when you take DNA tests, sometimes you find all of those percentages in there. So House Ancestry will be a great resource. We're going to add that to the website. And we are starting a internet radio show. I used to have I had a show at one time on 103.3 FM in Charlotte. The station sold out to a hip hop station. All the talk show hosts lost their shows and they took it to the internet. Some went to Blog Talk. I stopped some years ago and just periodically I'll put a video out, just periodically, something small. But we're getting ready to delve back into that big time. I'm gonna have a co-host, Andrea Free Spirit. She's something else. I'm surrounded by a lot of dynamic people in the tribe, a lot of good people. So all of that, all of those links will be added to the site. I have a cousin, also Ruby Thigpen. She is still trying to come up with the finances. I think $2 million, a minimum of $2 million for a movie called Two Nations. They have a trailer to the movie, and Two Nations, I think it's very fitting for what we're talking about today, because it's dealing with African and Native ancestry and the mixture and the struggles in America. So as we continue to add to the website. All those resources will be on there. The website is www. And I'll spell this out, skarurewokon.com. That's SKARUREWOCCON.com. And we're also getting involved with environmentalism. We have Jane Jacobs, who's very involved with that. She's working with Beth Marcassino out of Wilmington, dealing with the Gen X and the poisoning of the Cape Fear River. And she's very involved with the missing and murdered Indigenous women. She works very closely with Crystal, who's Okanichi Saponi as well. So as we compile all these resources, you'll be able to find them on our website. So just keep that website handy. You'll be able to find all those things there as well.
And Sutton.
Yes, so I'm the founder and executive director of the Urban Indigenous Collective, and we focus on the health and wellness of urban natives, specifically in the tri-state area. So we're here in New York City. And through that work, right now we're really working with the DOE and other structures to provide training and technical assistance. And right now we're really focused on training the DOE on how to be an ally to Indigenous peoples in the 21st century. So that's something we're really excited about, and something that we're pushing forward right now. We're also developing an app called Shop Talk. And so that app will serve to connect Native users with Native and Indigenous therapists. So that's something we're really excited about. And we just received the NYU Ignite Fellowship for that app. So that's in development right now. We have prototypes out. So you can check that out at www.urbanindigenouscollective.org. And so we're also doing some different Indigenous-led research as well, working on trying to create our own database for the East Coast for the missing and murdered Indigenous women also. I'm a part of a Survivors Leadership for Sovereign Bodies Institute, which actually holds the database for MMIWG. I also am a consultant. I support and lead Indigenous research for University of New Mexico, Florida State University, and I support the North America rep for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. And we work on putting out different recommendations and analysis on HIV and just different public health crises as they affect Indigenous populations globally. So I invite you to connect with us on our website. Again, that's www.urbanindigenouscollective.org. We're also on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and that's just the handle is Urban Indigenous Collective. So I look forward to connecting with you and learning more about any of your initiatives.
Great, and of course, lastly, arccenter.org, AARCC, or AARC Center, all one word, .org. You'll be able to find everything. This conversation will be there, as well as all the links for the various issues and topics that everybody was bringing up, websites and initiatives. And we're also currently creating 2 working research groups. One is a ARC Women's Research Working Group, as well as the overall ARC Research Working Group, which are basically designed to pull together scholars from various backgrounds to develop research, to develop, workshop, and publish research dealing with African American, Native American intersections and overlaps throughout the Americas. So these are still being compiled, but we're definitely looking for people who are willing to participate in that. You don't necessarily have to be a traditional scholar in the sense, but there is going to be some level of academic rigor associated with it, just for credibility purposes. And also, we are currently still developing our pilot incubation period under the journal ZANJ, the Critical Journal of Global South Studies, or Journal of Critical Global South Studies. We're doing a special issue under that, which should be coming hopefully later this year, dealing specifically with, again, this cross intersection between these people groups throughout the Americas. So we have a number of different perspectives being represented there, and that will eventually be our launching pad for our own standalone academic journal, a peer-reviewed journal, the Afro-Amerindian Research Journal. And yes, so going forward, we have a number of other initiatives, but we'll constantly be updating. hopefully we'll be able to continue conversations like this and have more roundtables. We are also in the works of having an artist Zoom meeting of sorts where African American and Native American artists can showcase their various works, also create art live online, and we'll also have live performances as well. And just, you know, a way for each individual artist to generate funds for themselves during this time when a lot of festivals, concerts, things of that nature are canceled or postponed. A way for people to still generate revenue. So we're in the development phase for that, but I just want to put out the announcement that we are looking for people. So definitely let us know. Social media handle is ARC Center, at ARC Center. You pretty much find us on Instagram, Twitter. We're also on Facebook. And we will be rebroadcasting this also on Facebook later today. So that is it. All right. So thank you all for joining us. Yes, sir.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
I have a book on Amazon. It's I Am Savage, and it's basically a martial arts, Native American martial arts. I had a Lakota friend said that he never heard of Native Americans in martial arts, so I was trying to explain to him that yes, we do. There's martial arts all over the globe, each continent, every culture. So, but what I'm doing is I'm looking to do workshops anywhere anyone wants to host them. And it's not just kicking and punching, it's teaching not only techniques in martial arts, but the cultural aspects. Why did we wear fringes? Why chokers and so forth? A lot of these things were to conceal your identity. That was fringes, chokers to protect your vital organs and so forth. So it's a cultural lesson as well. And it's a health and fitness. This summer is very important for our communities to start getting their bodies cleansed and shape and preparing for the fall, because a lot of people are they're expecting this fall to be a crazy with the virus and the spread of pandemic stuff going on. Hopefully it won't happen like that, but it's better to be prepared than unprepared. So it's a not only martial arts, but it's also teaching culture, and it's trying to get you fit. So if anyone is interested in hosting that in your area, just let me know.
And also I can also vouch for your abilities, because I saw a video of you throwing a tomahawk from like 30 feet and hitting a target. That was intense. So yeah, so you have one endorsement for me as far as that goes. All right. If nothing else, if anybody else have anything to add, we're going to wrap it up. Again, I appreciate you all for joining me, and hopefully we can continue this in different kinds of iterations and have more conversations going forward.
Yes. Thank you for organizing, and thank you everyone for sharing your stories and your time.
Wayne and Yako, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Have a great day.
All right, and everybody take care.
And I'm looking to stay connected with